Good evening. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Manu Pillai. I've known him for a few years now, and it's the second time he's speaking at IISER Pune. The first time was what a historian might call in BC, that is before COVID. And I'm thrilled to host him again today. Manu is one of India's most exciting young historians and writers, and best known for bringing alive hidden stories of the country's past. He is the award-winning author of several books, including The Ivory Throne, Rebel Sultans, The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin, and False Allies. And just last year, his latest book, Gods, Guns, and Missionaries, was published. He also received his doctorate from King's College in London a couple of years ago for his thesis titled Rajas, Ranis, Deity, and Company. And so please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Manu Pillai.
Thank you, Pushkar, and thank you for having me at IISER. As Pushkar said, the last time I came here was several years ago, and it was a smaller room. And I'm quite happy that despite the rains, we've managed to fill up this room today. So thank you to everyone who's made it. And I can see there are lots of students, but also lots of people from outside. So yes, very happy. And thank you, IISER, again for having me. Thank you to the director and everybody else. Now, normally I do most of my events in a conversational format, but because I was given strict instructions that this is a lecture, I've come here with a prepared text. Hopefully it'll all make sense, and then there's a segment where we have an audience interaction, so that's where we can have the more organic kind of conversation. So the topic today is, what is history? And I'm going to begin with a very neat and nicely provocative name when we speak about history, which is Savarkar. In the year 1909, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar wrote a book titled The Indian War of Independence. He was a young revolutionary in London at the time, and his aim was to produce a revisionist account of what the British called the Sepoy Mutiny, or the Indian Mutiny of 1857. Nehru was also a youngster at the time, and he called the book brilliant, though it showed, in his opinion, a want of balance now and then. But the British Raj, predictably did not approve of the text one bit. They saw in Savarkar words the grossest perversion of facts, crowned with a savage hatred for the white man's rule. The prohibition of the book came into effect even before its release, but that did not help. Savarkar's History of the Great Rebellion was smuggled into India, including sometimes disguised as the Bible. But consider for a moment just the terms in play. For the British, 1857 was best remembered as a mutiny. That's the word they wanted. A rebellion among soldiers who foolishly suspended their loyalties on account, it was claimed, of some silly beliefs. The Hindus did not want to use cartridges greased with cow's fat, and the Muslims were upset by the use of pig's fat. And when their religious feelings were upset, they lashed out. It was as simple as that in popular colonial retellings. On the one hand, this nicely tied into the stereotype of the superstitious, irrational native. On the other, it also indirectly absolved the British of any serious self-reflection. They could just blame the Indians for being over-religious. Of course, they knew perfectly well that 1857 was not just a mutiny. The way in which peasants, tribal groups, religious figures, and hosts of others rose up indicated clearly that the troubles had deeper roots. The soldiers lit the flame, yes, but the alarming manner in which the fire spread demonstrated that many in India were waiting for the right moment, and the match that happened to be lit in Meerut. Savarkar in 1909, therefore, was convinced that 1857 needed a more fitting name. Much of his history writing, by his own acknowledgement, was oriented towards arousing a sense of patriotism in Indians. He too was not studying the past out of pure academic interest, but with the intention of using it to inspire certain feelings, to generate a stronger sense of nationalism. So for him, 1857 became the Indian War of Independence. Many of us have subsequently learned of it as the first war of independence. Although in typical Indian style, we've also started to argue about whether this was the first one or whether something else was the first one, because there was Vellore in 1806, there was something else in 1721. So now everybody's sort of insisting that theirs was the first war of independence and not the one Savarkar branded the first war of independence. It's become a game of credit, with different parts of the country competing to claim the title. But there were other complications too to the narrative. Much of the South was not involved. Many princely rulers were on the fence, while others were actively in favor of the East India Company and not of the Indian resistance. And even the Sikhs, whose kingdom had been usurped less than 10 years ago by the East India Company, sided with the British and not with their fellow Indians. Naturally, these facts raise certain questions that may not sit well with a grand romantic history of the type that Savarkar preferred. What then is the right term for 1857? Was it a war of independence when large and substantial sections of Indian society sat it out? Was it only a mutiny? Or is the most sensible term Great Rebellion because it allows room for complexities in the narrative on either side? One can debate each of these formulations. In Britain, for example, even today children are taught of the Sepoy Mutiny. That's the term that is thrown around in the UK a lot. In India, in general imagination, we prefer Savarkar's wording and want children to imbibe the nationalism that this encourages. But think of it more broadly. If a single event, and one of the best known in our history, sees no consensus even on the right name for it, imagine the debates and disputes that are likely to form about the larger questions, about the nation, about religion, identity, historical figures, and political history. But why does history matter to start with? Firstly, it is all around us. Just consider how much is represented just in a glass of water. On the face of it, it is water, plain and simple. But not very long ago, it represented a whole lot more. There were people who could not serve water to others, and there were people who would not drink water offered by certain classes of people. As Jyotiba Phule wrote sarcastically in the 19th century here in Maharashtra, there were men who would drink cow's urine freely but refuse clean water from people of lower caste. In many parts of India, this has of course changed now, but in many parts it has not. A glass of water is still not just water, but a ritual transaction. It is still used not just to quench thirst, but to assert power, to remind people of who they are, where they stand in the hierarchy, how they must behave. Or as the Hindi expression goes, what their auqat is. So what seems to be a mere glass of water encapsulates a good deal of history, and not all of it is pleasant. Today, some of us have the privilege of picking up a glass without caring where did it come from, what is the name and caste of the person who poured the water. It is because people in the past fought for this. There is a history to how a glass of water became just water as opposed to another instrument of social and ritual status assertion. And again, I can to a great degree speak of this in the past tense. But for many others, as I alluded to earlier, this is still present tense. For them, the battle is not yet over. History, that is, overlaps into our own time. These changes, of course, did not occur overnight. I remember in my own family hearing about how the rules were slowly watered down as exposure grew and social values shifted. My grandmother's oldest brother was 18 years her senior. In his time, when he returned from school, he had to take a dip in the bathing tank and enter the house shirtless. You could not sit down for a meal with your shirt on because the shirt was seen as a foreign garment. It was brushed. And each time anyone went to a public place and returned, they would first have to take a dip in the water. I remember hearing also about how in some families, even using the car or the train was considered brushed. But that was the 1920s and 1930s. By the time my grandmother was growing up in the mid to late 1940s, the rules were amended. When she came back from school, she would stand holding an umbrella. Somebody in the house would take a pot of water and pour it over the umbrella. That way, you could claim to have become pure, but without the inconvenience of actually getting wet. By the time she was in her 20s, even this nonsensical shortcut ritual had died out. Obviously, by the time I came back from school, we were definitely not taking dips in the pond. There was no pond to start with. But to come back to my earlier question, history matters because it is everywhere. It is in the shape of our cities, in the structure and design of our buildings, in the fabric we wear, in the languages we speak, and even in our emotional lives and experiences. Childhood trauma, for instance, can scar a person for their whole lives. Social and historical trauma, too, it can be argued, works along similar lines. Communities and people remember the past in various, even conflicting ways, and draw meaning for themselves in the present from these memories. And this is precisely why history is often also a politicized commodity, not merely a matter of academic or general inquiry. But when we speak of history, whose history do we speak of? Like most things in life, this is a complex, layered phenomenon. And in a diverse society, there's also never just one prism or one view of things. To illustrate, take colonialism. As a phenomenon, it has around the world been a violent, repressive process. It has demolished native institutions, redrawn lines on the maps, created lines where there were no maps or lines, cut up communities, caused serious crises of identity, and the pain it leaves in its wake can often last generations. We, for instance, gained freedom in 1947, but even now live with so many big and small colonial influences. The very fact that I, and many others perhaps in this room, am most comfortable expressing myself in English is proof of this. But equally, colonialism also brought in dynamics that resulted in what we might call constructive change. In many ways, it forced us to introspect, reflect, and discard elements of our culture that were patently problematic. It was under colonial rule, for example, that Dalits were able to access modern education and organize themselves politically in potent new ways. Gandhiji discarded the white man's three-piece suit and preferred to dress like an Indian peasant, making a powerful political statement this way. But Ambedkar did the reverse. He wore and flaunted the suit because to him as a Dalit, it was a sign of empowerment. Gandhiji had the privilege and social capital to discard European garments for the loincloth. For him, there was an element of choice. Ambedkar's ancestors had no option but to wear the loincloth for centuries. To him, the suit represented not imperialism, but a sense of dignity. It was a breath of fresh air and liberty. So depending on where you stand and what your own experiences are, the same phenomenon assumes a different appearance. And to be honest, both these positions are equally valid. Gandhi represented the dissent of a nation against an oppressive colonizing force. Ambedkar challenged oppressive structures within the nation. We do not always have to choose one over the other. They can both be part of our larger understanding. In fact, this is the one thing we can say with certainty about history. It rarely delivers easy answers. What it does deliver are complications to ponder over. It does not offer comfort all the time. Instead, it can shake us up, challenging our very view of the world and even ourselves. Good history, in the end, is that which makes us think. If, on the other hand, one uses history merely to confirm biases, then something is amiss. But when we say whose history, another point I've noticed is also gender. We work with sources that are more often than not written by men, for audiences that were male, and amplify the male perspective. So while women played very significant roles in history, they were often written out of it. Or when they were written about, it was in the form of footnotes, marginal forces, or as minor figures, little cameos in history. I remember, for instance, when I wrote my book Rebel Sultans on the Sultanates of the Deccan, this part of India, I came across an image from the Tariq-e-Hussain Shahi. One of these miniature paintings from the 16th century depicts Hussain Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar. Present in the painting are 5 women. 2 of them are fanning the Sultan with fly whisks, and the other 3 are also court attendants, dressed in beautiful clothes. But next to Hussain on his gaddi or on his throne is a silhouette. It's just an outline. At one point, it used to depict his wife Khunza Humayun, a very powerful lady who ruled Ahmednagar for several years after his death and left a strong impression on the region's history. But somewhere in later times, this was frowned upon, the depiction of a royal woman in a picture like this. So the Begum, whose status was perhaps a little bit like Noor Jahan's was in the court of Jahangir among the Mughals, was literally erased. She was painted over and turned into a giant blob or a smudge. A good part of this was simply because she was a woman in a world of men. The scholar Arik Muran's study of Rajput hill states offers similar ironies. Rajput women were active political agents. In fact, there's this wonderful story around Parda in the 19th century where you think, Parda was purely this oppressive force where women were secluded, etc., without realizing that behind Parda, women did manage to wield influence, and some of them could weaponize Parda in very clever ways. There was a Rajput queen, I think in Jaipur in the 19th century, where she had no issues meeting her courtiers and her ministers, etc. She was in power, she was ruling. She had no issues meeting them, but every time the British wanted to see her, she'd say, no, I'm an Indian woman, I'm in Parda, I can't meet you. Because the Parda was used by her strategically to keep white people out and keep brown people in. But the conventional ways in which history was recorded among the Rajputs reflected cultural mores and certain biases in which women's participation could not be written about transparently. This has even afflicted historians of more recent times. I often mention how the role of Mughal women was underplayed. Earlier generations of historians assumed that the harem was not an important place. If anything, it was a negative influence, and it took feminist research to demonstrate that the harem was a political institution and that Mughal begums were economic powerhouses, diplomats, and formidable forces in the imperial court. We simply missed their stories because we were not looking for these stories. Our own conditioning sometimes eclipses certain things while emphasizing other things. No record of the past is perfect, and sometimes to understand history fully, we need to look at not only what the record says, but what it omits. We must read between the lines and observe not just the statements on record, but also the silences. For often the most interesting bits, the most fascinating questions around history lie in these spaces. This is not to say women's voices were completely absent. Indeed, leaving aside queens and powerful political women, we also have voices of more ordinary female figures from the past. Janabai in the 14th century, for instance, was protesting the domestic drudgery that was her fate as a woman when she wrote, very memorably, "God, do me a favor and kill my mother-in-law." Chhatrapati Shivaji had a contemporary in the Brahmin lady Bahinabai, who faced everything from child marriage to a physically violent husband. We often focus on the bhakti, the devotion to God that exists in the verses of these women, while looking away from the dissent and their critique on society, because much of what they stood up against continues to persist to this day. To notice this side of their writings is to hold up a mirror to ourselves in the present as well. And many prefer history to reinforce that which is powerful and established than to raise new questions. But even when there are no evident gaps, when there's a surplus of sources, one must still ask questions. Take, for example, the study of historical figures. I come from Kerala, where the King Martandavarma is a very well-known figure. As some of you might know, in the 18th century, he conquered a series of small states in southern Kerala and established a principality called Travancore. His conquests are violent and bloody. In his own lifetime and that of his heirs down to the 19th century, there was even some embarrassment about this. His nephew, for example, lamented on his deathbed, "Going to hell is unavoidable. I can never forget the horrors to which we have been parties during these wars." That's the nephew in a Darbar chronicle. If in fact Travancore's Rajas famously surrendered their kingdom to their deity in an act called Tripadidanam. That is, they went to the god in the temple to Padmanabha Swami and they said, "We are donating this kingdom to God and we are now going to rule as God's servants." So very conveniently, the king becomes God's servant and God becomes the sovereign of the state. But if they did this, it was partly also to escape this moral burden and odium. But how do records present Martandavarma? If I take the Balamartanda Vijaya, a Sanskrit source, I see one version of the man. In this, he is a dharmic king who is keen to renounce material possessions and purely serve his deity. It is the deity who comes to him in a dream or something, I missed the exact context, and asks him to conquer kingdoms and amass treasure. Why? So that Padmanabha Swami's temple can be rebuilt. In this court chronicle, in other words, Martandavarma's deeds are justified as part of a divine mandate. He spilled blood, waged wars and conquered territories, but all in service of God, not for himself, not because he was a king. It's a rather neat, convenient little explanation. On the other hand, in an oral tradition circulated among a marginalized caste group in Travancore called the Thambimar Kadhe, we see a different Martandavarma. Here he becomes a cunning figure, a man who breaks promises, who lusts for women, and so on. The dharmic king becomes an ultra-villain in this narrative, and all his actions are led by self-interest and personal glorification. This source sits at the other extreme compared to Balamartanda Vijaya. In the Thambimar Kadai, all that Martandavarma does is evil. He's presented not as a divine agent, but as a horrible, comprehensively flawed human being. By the 20th century, meanwhile, Darbar historians felt they had to justify the man in one more way. So we find a third interpretation in which Martandavarma conquers all these states to save Kerala. He feared, we are told, that the region would land under colonial rule, and it is to prevent this that he decides to unite the area under strong Indian leadership, his own. Or put another way, he did what he did out of almost nationalist impulses. Here there is a degree of projection. Nationalist values from a later period are retrospectively placed into the 18th century onto the person of a monarch. But either way, as per this narrative, Martandavarma is not merely a local king, but a national icon. Who then was the real Martandavarma? Was he a humble servant of God on a divine mission? Was he a ruthless conqueror, who in some sources and narratives is shown even plundering temples? Or was he a visionary leader who wanted to protect Kerala from European powers? The historian's job is not necessarily to answer these questions with one definite conclusion. It is not to select one option as if this is a multiple choice question with just one answer. The historian's role is to understand what these perspectives seek to communicate and to then try and make sense of Martandavarma in his own context. So was he cruel? Yes, he was. Was he devoted to his deity? Also true, though this narrative was used to paper over and justify some rather less than noble deeds. Some of the early Darbar chronicles themselves acknowledge this. Did he take a negative view of foreign powers like the Dutch? Absolutely. At the end of the day, he was a strong king, and strong kings tend to be ruthless. The dedication of his kingdom to his deity came later. At first, for nearly 2 decades, the man had a very violent career. We see something similar with Akbar as well. In his early years, he was a great conqueror, and like all conquerors, he could be cruel. The Akbar we celebrate, and people often use the anachronistic term secular for him, however, emerged only after this, only after his power was secure. Context ultimately is critical in making sense of the past. And once we learn to look at historical figures in their context, we escape this desire to identify everyone in history as either a hero or a villain. But it is a bit of a losing battle. At an academic level, yes, there are no heroes and villains in history, but human beings are also emotional. And we often have an emotional craving for narratives of good versus bad, of heroes versus villains. This too is a reality historians have to contend with. But what about the sources themselves? There was a time when written documents were privileged over all else. But we must remember that in our society, divided by caste, class, and several other such factors, access to literacy and written material was a very exclusive affair. Much of our consciousness of the past is preserved in oral history. So today, historians must work with diverse sources, oral accounts, art, architecture, objects, etc. Even with sophisticated written sources, one must be willing to examine them critically. For instance, when I was doing my first book on Travancore called The Ivory Throne, I always found the official state publications a bit amusing. In the 1850s, there was a real fear that the state would be annexed by the British on the charge of misgovernment. To prevent this, the local government began to actively promote an image of themselves as modern rajas, as modern rulers, as men of progress and of good governance. One part of this strategy involved publishing yearly records in the English language because they wanted the white person to read their reports, detailing all kinds of things, how many schools were opened, how many new roads were built, how many bridges were built, etc. Today, some people take this at face value and say how wonderful, how progressive, see how much was achieved, etc. Yes, at a broad level, compared to other princely states, Travancore was better off. But we must also watch against falling for propaganda. A lot of things written in these documents existed just on paper. For instance, roads were thrown open formally to all castes in the 1920s. I asked several people in my own ancestral village, which was in Travancore, about this. They all answered that in their memory at least, roads became accessible to all castes only in the 1950s, well after independence. That is, yes, the Travancore government issued orders opening roads. In practice, however, officials at the local level did not always implement these orders. So we must credit the Rajas for taking the right step, but we must also be aware that the system itself was such that not everything was decided in the capital, and whatever was decided in the capital wasn't actually implemented on the ground. This sort of thing happens even now. Every time we meet a problem, whether it is related to women's safety or education or anything else, we create a fresh law. On paper, it sounds wonderful, but we lack the state capacity to really implement these laws. Similarly, governments produce data that create certain impressions. It is good journalism that helps us look at the granular details until we realize that the picture is not as handsome as it seems. In a sense, the historian's job is similar, except we aren't uncovering the present, but the past. And the past had its own forms of propaganda. Chronicles written by different groups, for example, promoted their ideas even as they pretended to tell the objective truth. But it was really their truth, not the truth, that these were telling. So to go back to my earlier example, as much as the Balamartanda Vijaya offers one type of truth in which Martanda Varma is a noble, very powerful figure, the Thambimar Kathe at the other end is not objective either in its abject villainization. Both represent different kinds of interests, one royalist and one anti-royal. A good historian should be able to analyze both without getting swayed. We do not always succeed. After all, historians are also human beings with their own limitations, but we must certainly attempt to move in this direction. Speaking of swayed, religion is the other big issue in history, one that causes all kinds of debates and disputes and sees historians branded in certain ways. In my own case, depending on which of my books people have read and their own proclivities, they've said different things. With my first book, someone on stage at a literature festival said that it was an anti-Hindu text. With my book on the Sultans of the Deccan, I was called a Muslim appeaser. Wonderful words. With my fifth, I've been called many further names. One person emailed an ex-employer of mine saying it was an anti-Brahmin book. Another said it was anti-Christian and that I was a Brahmin apologist. When I was doing my edits, I myself joked to my editor that depending on the chapter, I could be branded a whole lot of things. Given the times we live in, the poor thing was alarmed and sent the thing for a legal review, the manuscript, before the book was even edited. And the lawyer came back with heaps of suggestions for deletions on the count of hurt sentiments. The fact is that as we study complex subjects, different things are highlighted. But because most people prefer simplistic answers instead of looking at the substance of the matter, they're tempted to reduce things to black and white or sometimes to attack the messenger. In India at present, we have two broad contemporary claims, at least in popular imagination. One refuses to acknowledge any kind of religious animosity in Indian history. Until the colonial period, it asserts, we were all getting along fabulously and the country was some kind of pluralistic paradise. In contrast, we have other present-day narratives in which all of history is a kind of dramatic religious and civilizational war, Everything is perceived through the prism of religion. The facts, however, show something that sits in the middle. At elite levels and in political spaces, we do find religious animosity and suspicion from quite early on between Hindus and Muslims, for example. Political as well as literary material hints at this, such as the writings of Vidyapati in the 14th century or Eknath in the 16th century. But does this mean most people were fighting all the time? No, they still managed to get along and actively share in each other's faiths and cultures. That is, life was complex back then, just as it is today. 300 years from now, if a person were to read just the speeches of certain politicians and conclude that Hindus and Muslims were constantly fighting in India, would that be accurate? No. Those speeches hint at tensions, yes, but they do not reflect the pushback and the resistance to identity politics and other counter-narratives which also exist. For that, they will need to look elsewhere, sometimes in the gaps. For a fuller picture, one must widen one's sources. To give a historical example, it is true that Chhatrapati Shivaji in Maharashtra cast himself as a Hindu hero. In the Shiva Bharata, a Sanskrit work he commissioned in his time and in his court, he's presented as Vishnu reborn to rid the earth of Muslim rule or Muslim power. It is hard to ignore the religious undertones here. At the same time, however, a number of Maratha chronicles of Bakhars, the Chitnis Bakhar, Chetgaonkar Bakhar, even the Shiva Bharata itself, although it doesn't name the name, note that his father and uncle were named after a Muslim Sufi. His father's name was Shahaji and his uncle's name was Sharifji, and they were named after Shah Sharif of Ahmednagar. The story goes that his grandparents were unable to have children, and it was Shah Sharif's blessings that finally worked. And so to honor the Sufi, the boys were named after him. We have Pushkar Sohoni here in the audience, and I remember reading in one of his books that even Shah Sharif's dargah is said to have been constructed by the Chhatrapati's grandfather Maloji. Compare this also to the tradition among Rajputs, that Shekhawats are named after an ancestor blessed by a Sufi called Sheikh Burhan. Here too, it was a Sufi's benediction that led to the birth of a son. He was called Rao Shekha after the Muslim man, and it is his very Hindu descendants who came to be known as Shekhawats. That is, it was entirely possible on a day-to-day basis for people to get along and participate in one another's religious cultures. But equally, when it came to power and politics, religion could be used to assert a very different idea. Something we still see in our politics in our own time, where religion is used very often instrumentally. I also give the example of Tipu Sultan of Mysore. Within Mysore, he patronized Brahmins, gave grants to temples, sent Shivlingams to Sringeri, and asked for pujas to be done to those Shivlingams. But when he invaded Malabar in the same period, the same man was capable of using religious rhetoric to justify conquest and occasionally force conversions on people. The same man, in two different geographical spaces and contexts, behaved very differently. This suggests that both impulses were in play. It is only that they were not applied uniformly, and we should not fall into the trap of siding with either extreme. If there was religious animosity, it must be admitted and examined. Just because something happened in the past, something that makes us unhappy or uncomfortable, we should not try to brush it away or dismiss it as irrelevant. In fact, a proper historical understanding can sometimes be perverted by good intentions. Many people deny religious tensions in the medieval period because they fear it will be used to justify present-day religious conflicts. The fear is valid, but my own view is that we must tackle these complicated subjects head-on. It is by avoiding them that we create room for these themes to be misappropriated, for things to be exaggerated, and to be turned into political fodder, for them to be weaponized. As the old saying goes, sunlight is the best disinfectant. The more we know, the more transparently we study and analyze things, the better it is for everyone. I must confess that as I was writing this segment of the talk, I did worry about whether some people might deliberately misinterpret my words. This is the other thing with doing history at present, the fear of those hurt sentiments that my publisher's lawyer was so worried about. We've always had a passion in India for this, but today this business of taking offense has truly become India's national sport. I was in my mid-20s when my first book was published 10 years ago. Sometime later, I received a defamation notice from some royal descendants in Travancore demanding 5 crore rupees in damages. I had 0 crores to give, and I sent a counter demonstrating that the so-called objectionable material came from solid archival sources. The matter was dropped. But it was an early lesson in the perils of attempting to communicate history with all its nuances, especially when it goes against received wisdom or long-established narratives. One always wonders, therefore, who will be upset this time? Who will use this to make personal attacks? I'm not saying I'm perfect or that my conclusions are the only conclusions that can be reached. But there is a shrinking of space without doubt, and I know of many writers who speak of self-censorship creeping into their work. Fear, after all, tends to be infectious. And that is a tragedy. For if we cannot even freely, openly and fearlessly discuss our past, how are we going to freely, openly and fearlessly shape our future? But this is not a question that historians alone can answer. We're all part of this, and we must all find our way together. I leave you with that thought. Thank you for your patience and kindness.
Yeah, we'll be happy to take questions if anybody has any. Right here.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Prasanna, a PhD mathematics student. So my question is, so do you support the abrogation of 295A in the erstwhile IPC?
Sorry, what?
295A, the clause which talks about religious sentiments being hurt can be prosecuted. So do you believe that that should be gone from Indian?
Yeah, I think especially given how easily our religious sentiments are hurt. When I was doing my research for my latest book, I was reading some of the newspaper debates that Tilak and some of his contemporaries had here in Maharashtra in the Marathi language, and it's astonishing the things they were able to get away saying. Because today, if we had the same kind of debates in papers, we'd all be in jail under some clause or the other of the Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita. I think their generation was better for it because a lot of the work they were able to do, including social reformers, etc., was because these conversations were being thrashed out in public without fear. People were lampooning anything and everything. If you read some of Phule's language, for example, when he criticizes the caste system, etc., it's astonishing because it's written with such bluntness that you really fear for him if had the man lived in a different time. That's the language that's used. So I think if our ancestors could take that in the 19th century and not take it so personally, they could see that this was about a larger question, we should be able to do it as well. It's just that in the age of social media and technology, etc., something that is said in one context travels much further. So say you have a debate here in Maharashtra, but it's reaching audiences in Uttar Pradesh and Kerala across the country, which means that more and more people can therefore take offense and then file cases. Often the cases are filed in faraway places. You say something in Kerala, the case will be filed in Assam deliberately, so you're harassed into never opening your mouth again. But that's again a risk we have to live with. But I don't support any clauses that clamp down on having these conversations.
Hello, Dr. Manu. This is Kedar. My question is that Jinnah and Savarkar both were the proponents of the two-nation theory, which later resulted in the partition of India. But in the popular consensus, most of the times we blame only Jinnah, and Savarkar is not given much of the blame for the partition of India. So why do you think it is?
Yeah, I think it was Savarkar in 1937 who mentions that somewhere in one of his Hindu Mahasabha speeches, I think he says that there are two nations in India. The difference, though, is that Jinnah believed in two nations and eventually in two states. He wanted two states as well. Savarkar believed in two nations and one state. And he believed that one of these so-called nations would have to be subordinated to the other dominant community. I think the long-standing thing is that for the longest time, most people weren't particularly paying attention to Savarkar's reading of things, because if you look at the broad arcs after independence, because of Savarkar's own history, he was embroiled but not convicted or anything in Mahatma Gandhi's murder, etc. He was out of favor and out of fashion in many ways, and he died in a sort of bitter state in the 1960s. So his writings were not particularly taken with the seriousness in the phase after independence. Instead, it was other narratives, the government-approved nationalist narrative, etc., that was popularly known by people. And in that, Jinnah was resoundingly blamed for what he said. I think there's also an underlying fact that, till Savarkar came around in the late 1930s, you could have joint membership of the Hindu Mahasabha and the Congress, because the Congress was such a big tent that there were conservative elements within the Congress also. There were elements that were sympathetic to Savarkar, there were elements that were sympathetic to the RSS and other organizations on the Hindu right, even within the Congress, which meant that perhaps there was also a sort of subtle play to sort of not go into that aspect of what they said and what they believed in, and point fingers primarily in the direction of the man who had ultimately caused partition, which was Jinnah, because he had the clout and the muscle eventually on the ground. So I think it's a combination of these factors. But these days, more and more people are aware that Savarkar also did use that terminology. But the difference is, Savarkar didn't believe in partition or two states. He believed in one state, but just one nation in control, and the other so-called nation in submission.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. In the context of the history which has been written not only in the current times but also in the last 30 to 40 years, especially in the viewpoint of the Indian history, there is a lot of emphasis given to political history and economic history to a certain extent, and to a large part cultural history, including your own work. Being in this institution and being a professor here, I feel that there needs to be emphasis given also to the scientific and the technological aspect of the history, which is sometimes severely lacking and does not actually fill in the gaps which are necessary for us to appreciate what people thought about. Could you please elaborate on these points, because you have a very broad perspective, and also I have seen in your own work and writing where there are some references to this. It would be important for us to also elaborate this point and look into it.
I think you've hit the the hammer on the nail, because it's actually quite fascinating if you are looking at the history of science in this country, especially in the colonial period, because the appetite Indians showed for Western science in that period sometimes went against the growing nationalistic impulse, because there was genuine admiration for some of the West's technological advancements, and Indians were deliberately very keen on having that. They wanted access to that. You actually find cases like people like Raja Raman Roy in Bengal. They did not want, at the time Raman Roy was sort of doing his writing in the 1820s and 30s, the British were still often funding Sanskrit colleges and setting up traditional educational institutions in India. And there was a big debate between the so-called Orientalists and the utilitarians, etc. And Raman Roy said, no, we don't want more of this. We've got plenty of Sanskrit colleges, we've got plenty of Sanskrit gurus. What we want is modern science. So then a group of Hindus and some dissenting Englishmen put together the money and set up what is called Hindu College to study modern science, modern chemistry, geography, things like that. You have cases like Sarforji of Tanjore, a Maratha prince in the early 19th century, who does this very interesting experiment where he takes Western knowledge but puts it in Hindu molds. For instance, they have the Kuravanji play format in Tamil Nadu, where there's a fortune teller and usually a goddess, and they have a discussion in which maybe they'll talk about Rameshwaram and Tirupati and all the sacred geography of South India. Sarforji replaces that in the Kuravanji, and he basically has a geography lesson imparted by talking about everything from Africa to America. He doesn't seem to have known of Australia much, but he got every other part of the world covered. So his students, learning in a traditional format in the Tamil language, etc., were picking up Western knowledge in a very familiar way. He had an associate who wrote about Noah's Ark. He was a Christian man, an Indian Christian. But when he described the creation of Noah's Ark, a very biblical story, he also describes all the types of wood that were used, and it was all different kinds of wood that you find in Tamil Nadu. So it's a way of also educating children about the kind of species of trees that are available in their local geography. You also have cases in Bengal where there are efforts being made to translate words like hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, etc. into Sanskrit. Some of these words are impossible to even pronounce because they were just invented words. And people had huge debates on whether we should just transliterate the English word into Indian languages, or do we need Indian words to actually reflect this? How do you translate hydrogen? So then people would say maker of water in Sanskrit. That's how they would ultimately define it. But there was a great appetite for Western science, but again, not in a slavish way. What's interesting is that you can actually look at the evolution of scientific knowledge in India from a social history lens as well. Because people took Western science, but then used it not to worship the West, but to try and stand up on their own feet and answer the West in terms of nationalism, etc., etc. So it's actually a very interesting concept, and I hope someone does an accessible book on the topic. There's good academic literature in some pockets, but there isn't enough in terms of a general book that ordinary people can understand and see how much knowledge of science and technology mattered in the freedom struggle. Even in the princely states, it's a very long-winded answer, but a princely state like Mysore, they got back their power in 1881 after 50 years of British rule. And by then the British had already established governance structures, bureaucratic structures. And the Rajas were very keen that they should have something distinct about Mysore. And they kept pouring money into projects that were industrial projects, factories, the Institute of Science, things like that, because they wanted to make a political statement using science. The British claim was that the native did not know how to do science. The native was irrational. The native could never do technology. And the Mysore government, even though a lot of these were white elephants, even though they never saw a profit from some of these factories and iron and steel works, etc., they kept pouring money into it because they were making a political statement and wanted to show that actually brown men can do science without the guidance of the white man. So there is a very fascinating story to be told through the history of science. Yeah, and I hope someone does that someday. Where are you?
नमस्कार सर। मेरा क्वेश्चन पार्टीशन के संबंध में है। यदि उस समय की कांग्रेस वर्किंग कमेटी और नेहरू गवर्नमेंट अगर पार्टीशन पे साइन नहीं करते तो क्या पार्टीशन पॉसिबल था?
बहुत वायलेंस हो जाता, इसीलिए आई थिंक दे वर कीन टू अवॉइड दैट सिचुएशन. ये इतना सच है कि इवन टिल द अर्ली 1940s जिन्ना को भी कोई होप नहीं था कि पार्टीशन एक्चुअली होगा. It was a bargaining chip. Jinnah used partition and the threat of partition to try and extract more and more concessions that he wanted. फिर वो जो सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर के टाइम पे क्विट इंडिया मूवमेंट शुरू हो गया, द कांग्रेस रिफ्यूज टू कोऑपरेट विद द ब्रिटिश गवर्नमेंट, दे ऑल एंडेड अप इन जेल, एंड द ब्रिटिश नीडेड allies from Indian society and India's political framework to participate and sort of talk to the British government and legitimize some of their actions. उस समय जिन्ना और हिंदू महासभा को वगैरह ज़्यादा स्पेस दिया गया था ब्रिटिश गवर्नमेंट के साइड से. Through that, Jinnah's influence and the Muslim League's influence began to grow because the Congress leadership was out of the picture. They were all sitting in jail for a long time. तो उस टाइम पे जिन्ना और मुस्लिम लीग का प्रोफाइल बढ़ा, एंड देन पाकिस्तान बिकेम मोर एंड मोर ऑफ अ रियलिटी ऑन द ग्राउंड एज वेल. दैट आइडिया ऑफ पाकिस्तान स्प्रेड इन इन्फ्लुएंशियल क्वार्टर्स. उसके बाद आफ्टर बाय 1947 it would have been very tough to put the genie back in the bottle. So there are critics who say that initially when Jinnah was using this as a bargaining chip, etc., it could have been thwarted in an early stage. 1947, I think it was too late. They would not have been able to do that unless they were prepared to deal with the risk of major violence in the country and potentially even civil war. And it's not just partition. Aap dekhe ki even when India took over Hyderabad, right? Nizam of Hyderabad wanted to be independent. We call it police action, but it was actually a full-blown military takeover and invasion of Hyderabad. You saw violence there also because this violence spreads. In Pakistan, in Punjab, for example, a lot of Sikhs were obviously affected because of partition. It was a lot of Sikh soldiers who then came to Hyderabad. And there was a mass slaughter of Muslims because they had the memories of what partition had done to their families, and they carried that into Hyderabad. And there was widespread bloodshed in Hyderabad. That the report of the government after this particular massacre in Hyderabad was never officially published. Leaked versions exist, and they've been published in recent years. You can find them on the internet. I think it's called the Sundarlal Committee report. And they estimate somewhere between 25,000 to 50,000 Muslims were killed in Hyderabad in Operation Polo during the takeover. The Arya Samaj and other groups were also at that time pretty violent on the ground. So I think by 1947 it was really looking pretty bad, which is why the leadership of that time perhaps felt that they had no option but to concede Pakistan to minimize the amount of civil unrest that could have been caused in the name of religion.
Excuse me. Good evening, sir. I'm Gagan. I study at Symbiosis. I wanted to ask you a question. So now, because in the past few years, we have seen a lot of historical retellings through film media. And in your lecture also, you told us about the importance of perspectives. So what is your opinion on the supposed nationalist retellings that we have seen in the past few months, and these retellings having an effect of violence in the country?
I think my answer to this is that revising history is always something that's done. History as a discipline improves through debate and disagreement. So say I've connected the dots one way and I've reached a certain conclusion. Someone else will connect the dots in a different way tomorrow, and that might be an even better way of connecting the dots and reach a slightly different conclusion from mine. So the subject improves from debate and disagreement and further conversations around history. So history is a subject that's always evolving. Sometimes technology matters, right? 100 years ago, they didn't have access to DNA information on the Harappan civilization, our genetic background. They didn't have access to all of those things. So they were speaking in terms of theories. Today, a lot of those theories can be confirmed using scientific evidence. So things change like that. But my issue with a lot of the recent revisionist history is that the claim being made from the right is that, all the history kids were taught so far was Marxist history, as if there was some great conspiracy to teach leftist history. My feeling is that even though there was a leftward tilt in history for a long time, in Indian history, it was not some deliberate conspiracy. It was just that generation of historians had seen the violence partition had done. They came out of a society that was keen to move beyond that, to come up with a new vision for India, etc. There was a natural conditioning because of that. Even if you say that they had a conspiracy to sort of give a leftist version of history, the answer to that is not to skew history towards the right. You're saying this is skewed, and then you're skewing it in the other direction, right? What suffers ultimately? History only. The answer should be to do a more sober, mature, balanced, even-handed kind of history, right? That is not being done. In the name of correcting past sins, you're actually skewing it in another direction. So remember that there's always historians, and then there are court historians. The job of a court historian is to sing praises and make you feel good. So court historians' history of any ruler, even back in the days, only good things. This ruler was divinely inspired. This ruler, even as a baby, spoke 5 languages, things like that. That's what court historians do. Serious historians take a step back and know that everything is written with a pinch of salt. So you have to then judge the quality of the work that you're reading based on the approach of the historian as well.
Thank you for delivering your talk. It's not every day that I see historians talk about the nuances of history. Most people just get into the specific niche. My question is, you mentioned that there was, I have two questions, I think. My first question is, you talked about the growing interest Indians took in science as and when the British came. So my question is, if so many Indians were eager to adopt science, was there ever such a thing as scientific thinking before the European powers came? And if so, was there such a history? Because I am aware of astronomical and mathematical texts that exist, but was there ever a thing of passing down an ordered way of thinking that was anyways similar to or resembling science?
So that was one question at the end of the day. Not two. Unless you have another.
Yeah. So the other question is, I have heard that the Indian way of looking at history is different, and that rather than focusing on exact facts and figures of what happened, it is more of what history might mean to people relatively. It's a more subjective this thing. So how relevant do you find that in today's modern understanding of history?
It's true. I'll answer the second part first, which is that it's true that a lot of Indian sources have a historical consciousness. They're communicating something that perhaps has certain historical truths to it, but it's not done in a way that we would recognize today as a footnoted, perfectly sort of cited kind of history. That history as a discipline is a relatively recent evolution, even in the West. It only really begins from the 18th century, etc., where people start studying history as history. For the longest time, that kind of historical writing was just considered a branch of literature, even in the West. So as a discipline, history is a relatively new discipline. So in India, yes, for the longest time, this has various reasons for it, right? On the one hand, we're a tropical country where records don't last very long. In South India, for example, people would write on these palm leaf manuscripts and they would disintegrate over a couple of generations. So a lot of very serious historical consciousness was preserved in song and lore and traditions, storytelling, which was able to communicate and pass this down the generations more easily without saddling you with the exact facts and figures. Even when texts were written, sometimes they were written with a loose fidelity to history, but to make certain points. And in some ways, I think what we today call the Hindu rights approach to history is a continuation of this, which is using history not so much to quibble over the facts and figures and the minutiae or the exact aspects of it, but to use it in a broad arc to reach certain conclusions or to transmit certain messages. That continues to a certain extent in India. As I said, we are also a society divided by caste and community and all of that. So sometimes the same historical events are also remembered by different groups in different ways, just as historical figures are remembered in different ways. So from the perch of an emperor of Delhi, the Sikhs and the Marathas were rebels. But from the perch of the Marathas who are writing in the same period, they're not rebels. They're actually standing up to injustice and tyranny and imperialism and things like that. So you're getting two different versions already over there. So it's true that we have a slightly different approach to history, but you can cull out a lot from that. If you're a pretty critically oriented, well-trained historian, that's not really a barrier in your way. In the West, the advantage they have is they've got a lot of detailed information, birth records going back 600 years, lots of paperwork is preserved, the letters of Mary, Queen of Scots, things like that. There's a lot of hard data that's available. In India, we often have prashastis, and we've got a different type of sources. So the approach you take is slightly different because of that. Your first question was on the scientific tradition. This is difficult for me to answer because I haven't really studied this in and of itself. But yes, I think you're right in the sense that although we have exceptions going back into, let's say, 1,000 years ago or whatever, who did achieve certain scientific breakthroughs, etc., somehow they did not end up fathering a scientific tradition or a literate tradition. There are exceptions to this. You do find cases here and there in India where people did know things, people did have interesting experiments, but somehow it did not take a life of its own. There are various theories as to why this did not happen. Some say, for example, caste was a barrier, which is that you need to have all minds able to think about these questions as opposed to just a very small literate elite. If it's just within that elite, then it's never really going to improve because you need multiple minds to apply themselves to these questions. For example, I'm pretty convinced that if you look at the old carpenter communities in India, they would have known a degree of mathematics and geometry and all kinds of things. It's just that we don't have records because none of them were literate communities in the sense that they were sitting down and writing what they knew. These were just passed down their family traditions, and they were used in their family vocations, but not theorized, not written down as textbooks, etc., etc. Those tendencies existed in Europe as well. It's just that in Europe, starting, say, from the 1400s onwards, due to historical dynamics of their own, certain changes took place. In a previous time, it was in the Islamic world that certain dynamics took place, and there was a sort of development of science and mathematics in the Islamic world. There was a time in in India's history also where we had greater space for these things, but then that period wilted. So it's tough to answer that. You'd probably need to go to an expert to get a more exact answer, but this is at least the way I've read this and encountered this material in my reading.
Since it's been almost an hour, I think I'm going to pool some questions together, and then you can answer them all at once. So I had 3 hands.
I also think that side of the room
Yeah.
is feeling a bit neglected.
Yeah, no, there is a hand there too.
Yes, so we were introduced. You've answered a lot of my questions, but I was actually looking at, and you can answer it, on the issue of oral history. You spoke about it, because I work with pastoralists, and a lot of their traditions and history, as you mentioned, are in the oral form transmitted. And there can also be loss of knowledge there because things change, their narratives change, and from one generation to the other they can be. So how does one kind of deal? How do historians deal with it? The other thing is the missing person, like the gender part of it you said. When it's not spoken and it's not then transmitted intergenerationally, we run the risk of losing an entire narrative, and then you have only the danger of a single narrative maybe, which is the one from a dominant perspective. So just, you can answer it. You've answered a lot of it, but it's some more on that.
Hi, I'm Srijani. I had a small question for you actually. You mentioned that you aren't fond of the laws that clamp your freedom to speak and express and write in favor of religious sentiments, but that isn't how reality really is. So as a historian and an author, how do you balance your honesty to history and the juggling of these hurt sentiments? Because I'm assuming there has to be some baseline amount of balancing that you ought to do even though you don't agree with it. So I was just curious about that.
There was one question on that side. Who was it?
So what I wanted to ask was, you spoke about how there are different historical sources, they all have their own biases. There are different historians, they all have their own biases. Whenever you draw a conclusion from these facts, you have some bias. So can the quote-unquote ideal historian do anything other than just state facts and let it be? Or is it possible to come to an unbiased conclusion from history? So like, what is the job of an ideal historian?
To answer these 3? We'll go backwards. So since your question was on biases, I don't think there's ever going to be such a thing as completely unbiased history. It's not the fashionable thing to say, because these days we like to get into this virtue contest of which historian is truly biased, truly neutral, etc. The frank truth is, we are all conditioned by the society in which we are raised. So I was born into a certain caste background, into a certain class background, with a certain fluency in English, economic background. I was born male. All of these things conditioned the way I was raised and what I was exposed to, which in turn determined some of my choices of the subjects I want to study. Which is why sometimes you find that on the same subjects with the same evidence, a female historian is able to bring insights that are very different from what generations of male historians have been able to do. Simply because the perspective is different, and that can't be replicated perhaps by a male historian. And it matters. That's why it's not just important for us to have more women's histories, but we also need more women historians. And historians of all stripes as far as that goes. Now, in that situation, since bias is to some extent or the other, everybody will have some biases. There's no escaping that. The question is, if you're a trained and a sincere historian, you know how to minimize your bias. You know how you have to be led by the evidence as opposed to arranging the evidence around a prefigured conclusion. That is where the difference lies between a good historian and a bad historian. A bad historian is somebody who perhaps already has decided what they want to conclude and then just find evidence to prove that point. Whereas if you're a relatively more sincere historian, you will find that your own biases will be challenged and you should be okay with it. You will find situations where you have to say the unpopular thing, the inconvenient thing, which your tribe or your political group, etc., doesn't like, which is why you get called names subsequently, but that's a risk you have to take if you want to be true to the subject. It also means that sometimes, especially in a country like ours, when you're discussing controversial issues around religion, etc., you may have to say things where people will come and accuse you saying that, what if this is used politically by somebody? And you have to be like, look, that is not a battle I can fight. My duty is to the subject, and therefore sometimes I have to just pursue that, even if there might be some of these risks, because a historian also has certain risks in play. So I don't think there's ever going to be an unbiased historian, but you will always find historians where the bias is minimal, or the historian makes a conscious effort to reduce the role bias plays in their conclusions, versus other historians where the bias is visible from the first page itself. So that's the nuance I would point out there. I would never claim that my history is completely objective in the sense that this is the final word. No, 25 years later, somebody else studying the same subject may come to slightly different conclusions from mine, and that's fine, because they bring new perspectives to the equation. They bring a new gaze to the equation. They may have different tools. They may have access to more resources. Sometimes it's as simple as, what are the sources of evidence you have? Earlier historians, say in the 60s and 70s, didn't have the financial resources to fly to London and look at the colonial archives sitting in Britain. So they'd make do with archives in India. Today, because of digitization, etc., you're able to get material even from America and other parts of the world. Then there's linguistic stuff. We are so obsessed with British colonial records that we forget that there was a whole Portuguese and Dutch colonial history to India as well, and there's a huge trove of material in those languages. But most Indian historians are not trained in those languages, so we're actually not looking at those. But maybe with the technology and AI and God knows what, in the next 50 years, it'll become easier to access this material, which means a lot of books will be revised because of that. So there, the bias is not coming from the historian's mind. It's simply that the historian has a limited set of sources with which he or she are playing, as opposed to future historians who will have a wider berth in terms of the sources that they're dealing with. So a lot of these factors come into play there. On the question about free speech and how you deal with things, when my book's legal review was done by the lawyer who my publisher sent with, who asked me the question? You did. Yeah. So the legal review, it was sent to the lawyer, the manuscript, even before the edit started, and the lawyer sent it back with some 300 changes. Almost on every page there was something saying, this should be reworded, that'll hurt somebody, this will become problematic, la la la. Luckily for me, partly because I've been publishing for several years now, so I have a degree of clout and influence in these matters, I said, no, I'm only going to make 2 changes. And those 2 changes were fine. One was just a use of wording that was a bit naughty, which they said, look, avoid that. So I said, fine. The other was actually a quote, but it was a bit of a violent quote, which, again, the lawyer said, just paraphrase, don't use the actual words from the quote, because in today's India, someone may take offense to that. The remaining 298 odd changes, I simply did not accept. What was funny, though, was that although in her report the lawyer said that these God knows X number of changes have to be made in the book, she then sent a WhatsApp message to my editor saying, loved the book. So I found that very amusing, that you enjoyed the book, but you also want me to make changes, because the lawyer is just doing her job. Her job is to look out for everything and be as thorough as possible. So someone in my position has the choice to push back, because you have some degree of say in these matters, but a first-time writer may not be able to do it. If you're a first-time writer who's written a relatively controversial book, you may have to accept the publisher's recommendations without complaining too much. So there is a problem there, and I do see that as a bit of a problem. The other thing, though, is that you're always aware of a risk existing, even if you're not currently targeted. Because I used to work with a politician some years ago, I know that every time an election happens, a general election happens, something he wrote in a book in 1989 is brought up to say he insulted Naya women. It's actually a dialogue from a fiction book, but that's always brought up from 1989. It's brought up now in 2024, in 2019, 2014, to create a political controversy. So I'm very aware that even if today I haven't heard sentiments at the moment, for the last 6 months at least with my new book, it's very likely that someone will decide 3 years from now that now their sentiments are hurt and they want to take me to the cleaners. And I have to live with that risk. Ultimately, none of us can stand and virtue signal if we're not willing to stick our necks out. So right now I have the capacity and the privilege and other advantages of being able to do that. And there is some awareness that only if I stick my neck out can that first-time writer also get away with saying relatively controversial things. It's still not easy. There is a lot of censorship taking place. There's a lot of self-censorship taking place. That is really unfortunate because people now are second-guessing themselves even as they write, even in the language they use as they write. That is the worst thing because without even realizing it, you start censoring your findings. That's tragic. On the oral history and the gender thing, I'm going to combine the two. And I'll tell you a story that my grandmother told me. It's my current favorite story to tell in talks. Now again, this is not the kind of history of women you'll find in books. You won't easily find it recorded anywhere because nobody's recording these lived experiences. When my grandmother was growing up in the 1940s, there was still this custom where girls who had their periods had to go and sit in a separate room in the house because they were considered impure. The food used to be brought to them. Their clothes were washed by a specific person that did not wash the clothes of the other members of the family. They could not go and be in other spaces in the house, definitely not enter the kitchen, things like that. And there's a movie recently called The Great Indian Kitchen that was made on a similar theme. What's interesting, though, is that my grandmother was also a very rebellious person. And she told me this very fascinating thing where she said that although she was asked to sit in a secluded way like this and told that she was impure, every day for lunch, the rest of the family would go into another part of the building. It was at a slight remove from the main house, the kitchen or the place where they sat and ate. And when this happened, she used to emerge from this room, go around the house, touching everything, making it all impure. It included her father's desk, his clothes. She'd go and lean against the well. She would do everything she was not supposed to do, but secretly come and hide again in the room because she didn't want them to know that she was doing it. But it was her form of showing rebellion and disagreeing with this custom. I thought, okay, maybe that was just my rebellious granny, but I've also read in the memoirs of a Nambudri woman called Devaki Nilayangod. In her memoir, she writes about how, again, Nambudri Brahmin woman in Kerala, literate but not allowed proper education, not allowed to read newspapers, books, none of that. And watch. Nambudri women were the only women in Kerala who were in Parda, who were not allowed to meet other men, etc., etc. But what's interesting in her memoirs is she notes that the only time when these women were able to read was when they were in this menstruation room, because that's the one place where their fathers and brothers could not poke their noses because they didn't want to get impure by these women. So that is where they would read the newspapers, that is where they would read the novels, that is where they would read the books. So in a room that is a symbol of that kind of patriarchal control, they're subverting it from within and using it to access information and knowledge. Funnily enough, because they were Brahmin women and they were a bit orthodox, they also felt they were impure, and the book is Saraswati, so they can't make Saraswati impure. So they used to get maidservants to come in and turn the pages for them, so that the book itself would not get impure. There are so many layers to this. On the one hand, they've internalized the stigma. On the other hand, they're also subverting the whole institution. But it's fascinating history, right? But you're not going to find this in archives and sources. You find it in oral narratives. You find it in the memories of people. I'll give you one more story which got me cancelled last year on the internet. We'll see how this experiment goes here. But again, one of the advantages of being in your 30s is that you stop caring about being cancelled. So that's a good thing. And I recommend that to young people in their 20s also. The sooner you stop caring about other people's opinions, the better. The story is again from my ancestral village. While my grandmother's father and family had the land, the tilling of the land, the actual agricultural work was done by a couple of Dalit communities. Now, in keeping with tradition in Kerala, they were not allowed many things. For example, they could not come and look at the house. Their food was always served at a lower level of the property, where they would never look at the house and could not pollute the house by looking at it. They weren't allowed proper names. So every time they had a baby in the family, they would come to a particular corner of the estate, stand there, and they would shout in Malayalam, "Krati Kravittu." That is, not even she has given birth, they would say she has laid it, or something like that, as if their wives are animals or some kind of subhuman species. And whoever was in the main portico of the house, usually the eldest man in the house, would yell out a word, and that would become the name of the baby. And these names were usually names like Karta Utti, Valta Utti, Velumbi. I've met, in my childhood, there was a lady still in the village called Velumbi, whose name translates simply as white one, or fair woman. So their names were all tall one, short one, dark one, fair one. Those were the kinds of names they were given. And they were not allowed to take names of members of my family. So my great-grandfather's name was Madhavan. My great-grandmother's name was Kalyani. They could not take these names. But the story goes that as the 1940s, etc. came up, as communist culture was slowly building in Kerala, one fine morning, my great-grandmother hears her name, Kalyani, yelled out in the fields. And she's like, who dares take my name? Because nobody called her Kalyani. Everyone called her Tambrati, which means my lady. That's what they called her, not by name. And she sent out somebody to find out, and it turned out that these same Dalit farmers who worked for us, who were not allowed to take our name, who were not allowed to have Sanskritized names themselves, they had gone and named all the cattle after members of the family. So You had a cow called Kalyani, you had a buffalo called Madhavan, you had all kinds of names for all the farm animals, which you could now beat and kick and do whatever you wanted to. And anytime, anybody came, they'd say, oh yeah, we just named, out of respect, we named the cows after members of the family. Now, you all laughed. I got cancelled on the internet because I laughed when I told the story and said, you can't laugh. It's a very solemn story. It's about apologizing. But the thing is, again in the story, it is the marginalized who are using humor as a weapon to lampoon their caste superiors. So laughing is actually natural to the story because that is the whole point of this. The whole point of naming the cows after a member of the family was to use humor against their landlords. They did not have the resources and power to stand up and take a morcha because they would lose their livelihood. So in their own spaces in the field, where the landlords were at a slight distance, that is where they lampooned their landlords. So the laughter is the weapon here. There's a whole concept called weapons of the weak, which is exactly this. When you're marginalized, when you're oppressed, what are the weapons you have? It's not swords and things like that. It is things like humor. It is things like this. So these are also oral narratives that I was able to collect from my village. It is not from a book. It is not from some kind of written source. And that is, I think, the beauty of it, which is that unless historians go out there and collect these narratives, you're never going to get a full picture of history. Because the written history is always the history of the privileged and the elites, not of the marginalized and the people who are on the peripheries of society.
I'm going to pool the last two questions. So one's here and then...
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. I would just like to extend the lens a little bit towards education and history. I wouldn't say teaching of history, investigating history with my students. And as a historian, something that came up through this talk for me when a question to you as a historian from an educator is, something that came up is, history cannot be studied, it has to be investigated. That is one skill that, I sort of realized that should be taught to children before we throw facts at them and events at them and we dive deeper into it. What are some other skills that you would recommend that the facilitating or investigating of history we should empower children with, so that they're able to look at history from not this always hurt and offended kind of a thing, but really investigate the subject better?
I'll just get the last question too.
Yeah, thanks. I think this got answered a little bit. I wanted to ask you, as a professional, as a history professional, would you consider this not having a label as a very important virtue? Would the best of the professionals consider that as a ideal virtue?
Not having a label in what sense?
Not being labeled as a communist historian or not having a name. And would that be a virtue?
I think it's an advantage in some respects, but as I said, people, depending on the book and depending on the context, apply the labels they want. The thing is to liberate yourself from the label, because frankly, I've realized that even now, sometimes people are so ideologically committed that they refuse to see things even when evidence is thrown in their face. For example, at one point I remember someone sent me a screenshot of a YouTube comment saying that I was about to be offered a seat for elections in 2024 by the BJP in Kerala. While the BJP is accusing me of being a leftist, this is a leftist commenting that I'm getting a BJP seat. Why? One of the reasons is that there's this whole narrative in Kerala of Nangeli. I don't know how many of you have read this thing about the breast tax, which is about how the narrative most people know is that there was this tax on women of marginalized caste. If they wanted to cover their breasts, they had to pay the breast tax. The story sometimes, some versions goes on to say that the tax collectors would come and measure the breasts, and based on that, they would tax the women, etc. Firstly, this never, and there's this woman called Nangeli, who when they went to collect the tax, she cut her breasts off and said, you want the breast tax? Here, take my breasts. And she dies because of that. So she's a heroine in the communist narrative of Kerala's history and the anti-caste resistance, etc. Now, this narrative never completely convinced me from the start. Firstly, because there was no state capacity to go around measuring women's breasts. Even today in India, getting a census done is such a huge operation. This is a country where the first census took place after independence. Post-independence census, and to get people onto the voter rolls, etc. At that time, they actually struggled to even get the names of women because people were so conservative, they didn't want to give names of women. They would say things like Papu ki mummy, someone's wife, etc. because that women's names can't be put down in writing. So that is the context, and we know the limitations of state capacity. But leave that aside. Maybe they'd had enough bureaucrats and people to go around villages measuring women's breasts. The other problem was that going back to the early Portuguese period, you have sources consistently telling you that these white men would go to negotiate treaties with Kerala queens, and these queens were also topless. So I was like, there's something amiss here, because it's not just the marginalized caste women who are walking around topless. The queens are also described as topless. We have a case in 1605 where there's an Italian in the court of the Zamorin of Calicut, and he says that the queen and her daughters enter, and they're both wearing, they're all three wearing only loincloths. They've got lots of jewelry on their torso, but they're not covering their torso with fabric. In fact, the two girls go and touch him, saying that why is he covered so much in the heat? Because they couldn't understand why a man would be covered from neck to toes, because they simply walked around topless. Then you have visual evidence. You have so much visual evidence, including photographs from the 20th century showing the Rani of Cochin sitting enthroned in an armchair. She's got a munda around her waist and she's got a necklace around her neck, but she's not wearing an upper cloth. Then you have family photographs in which you can see the generational shift taking place. The eldest woman is topless. The next generation has a cloth but no blouse. The third generation is wearing a blouse, and so it goes on. So it's interesting that there's visual evidence, there's other kind of archival evidence showing that women across the board did not cover their breasts. Which then raises the question of what is this breast tax? It turned out that there was a poll tax that was charged on marginalized groups, where for the men it was called talakaram or head tax, and to distinguish the women, theirs was called molakaram or breast tax. It actually had nothing to do with covering breasts. It was simply a word that was used, which got misunderstood. Why did it get misunderstood? Because in the 19th century, with the coming of the Victorian gaze, with the coming of missionaries, etc., there was a new gaze on women's bodies, saying that women's bodies have to be covered up a certain way. Even today, when you enter a Kerala temple, men still have to take off their shirt. It's the same logic that applied to women. Even if you're a Brahmin woman back in the day entering a temple, you would have had to take off. If you had a cloth on top, you would have had to take it off. Because in front of a superior, you're not allowed to cover your upper body. Because that upper body, the cloth is a mark of caste status and a mark of your privilege. So the upper cloth that women sometimes wore wasn't to cover their breasts. It was loosely thrown across one shoulder as a mark of status. In fact, we also have cases where there's one potentially apocryphal story about how a social reformer in Kerala decided that now he's going to make all women chaste and they have to all now start wearing blouses. And in Thrissur or someplace, he had a procession of women in blouses to show that now all women must have blouses. And this was such an unheard of sight, women in blouses, that a huge crowd gathered in Thrissur. And all the women who had volunteered to walk in blouses got so self-conscious, they removed their blouses and ran away. This might be apocryphal, but we do know that in Travancore, in the court of the Travancore Maharaja, the British resident came and said, Maharaja, when I come to visit you, all the palace servants are walking around topless. They must all wear blouses. And they were made to wear blouses. But the moment they finished their service in the palace and left the gate in the evening, they would take off their blouses. My own great-grandmother, it was in her 40s, in the 1940s, when her second daughter was getting married, upper caste woman, that the in-laws side brought her what was called a rauka, which is this high-neck blouse that was popular in Kerala. And she wore it, she admired herself in front of the mirror. And then someone said, okay, now come outside, let everybody see you in your fashionable new blouse. And she said, no, how can I go in front of my father and brothers wearing a blouse? Because in their view, only women, courtesans and women of that pursuit, as it were, sexualize their bodies by covering up the breasts. No dignified woman would feel the need to cover their breasts. That was the logic that they came from, ironically. Today it's scandalous to us, but for them that was perfect logic. Now, because I have brought this out, that's punctured an element of leftist history. This Nangeli narrative, which is that, women were not allowed to cover their breasts, they had to pay a tax for this, etc., etc. The legend has sort of circulated in Kerala, including in tribal communities, of a woman cutting off her breasts. But it is really an anti-caste narrative. The woman is standing up in this story to an unjust caste-based poll tax. She's not standing up to protect her modesty, because that logic of modesty comes from white people in the 19th century. When even the queen is walking around topless, covering your breasts for your modesty is not a logic that would have applied to Nangeli. But simply for pointing this out, I've now been branded in that particular context as, let's say, a rightist or whatever. And apparently I'm being offered seats from the BJP. So there's that kind of stuff that you deal with. So again, it's a risk I'm willing to take, not having labels. Having labels, I can see why some people prefer that, but it gives you a tribe, it gives you a supportive ecosystem. Whereas not having labels means that both sides are confused, and then you don't have someone to back you up in case of trouble. But we'll see. When I get into trouble, I'll give you a more convincing answer as to whether this was a mistake, not choosing a tribe. On the earlier question on education, I think it's not, who asked me the question? Where are you? There. Yeah. So I think the important thing is not linked to history itself. I think in general in education in India, we don't cultivate critical thinking. We never teach school children to ask the whys and hows of what they're studying. You're taught this is the sum total of things, ratamorify this and then write it in an exam. Whereas actually what you need is to get people to think, which is, why is this the conclusion? How did we reach this conclusion? Why does this matter? Those are the questions that students should be taught to ask questions, not to just consume information without interrogating it basically. And you yourself said it, right? History is an interrogation of the past. It's not anybody who gives you a claim that, oh, my narrative of history is the final word on it. It's not true. Everything is a narrative based on your understanding of the past and your interrogation of the past. That is also important for students and other people to understand. As I said, when I come and present here, I'm not giving you gospel truth. I'm giving you my understanding of history based on X number of years of research, based on so much experience built over 5 books or whatever. It could still be a flawed conclusion in some respects. It's still not the perfect conclusion. And you should be empowered to even think of it that way. You should be empowered, the student should be empowered to stand up and say, actually, wait, why have you reached this conclusion? I don't understand it. So the teacher has to then explain it. But that's not linked purely to history. It's linked to all of the social sciences and humanities in general. And that's the culture we should be cultivating. But that only creates more work for teachers, I think. And given that we are a very, very populous country, which still faces a very uphill task in just getting people basic literacy and education, I don't think governments also see much incentive in this. Government works on budgets and quotas and just getting as many people into the education system as possible, which means sometimes the incentive is to keep things as basic as possible, just so that more and more people will pass through the system, and you can get your statistics saying that, look, 90% of kids passed standard 10 this year, 95% passed the next year, and so on and so forth. Critical thinking means you have to invest in training teachers, you have to invest in the classroom in a different way, and that's not easy. Which is why the hope really is not at school level. For me, the hope is at higher education level. It's when kids come to college at least, in those spaces at least, that you can encourage some critical thinking. And hopefully IISER is doing that right. At least from your questions, I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I hope you got your wish of having a more interactive session. You lectured for half an hour, but we managed an hour of questions and wonderful answers. So as a token of appreciation, here is something from IISER. Does he want a photo op? Thank you. His books are outside, so feel free to buy them.
Thank you again, and thank you for being a very patient audience. Thank you, Pushkar, for having me, and thank you to IISER again.